Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to Dungeon Master U, where you are the Dungeon Master. Stay tuned after this video for an important announcement regarding the things that I make. Intro. Bleep boo. Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, my significant other and I took a trip out to Seattle to visit my brother for Thanksgiving. It was November, so the park he lived near, nothing special, just a creek running through the woods, was suitably gray and wet. This seemed, for some reason, like a wonderful time to take a hike through the woods. As we set off, a thick mist settled over the water, tangling in the trees and laying heavy over the wet black dirt. We could barely see more than a few yards ahead of us when out of the mist trotted a miniature pony. All white, maybe 3 feet tall with ribbons tied in its mane. Right after it trotted past us, 2 little girls dressed in ballerina tutus appeared out of the mist chasing after it. They ran past, hot on the trail of the miniature pony, and disappeared. We stopped, dead in our tracks, unsure of what to do. Silence fell on the misty forest, and all I could think was, what a stupid random encounter. Random encounters are a key part of what makes a tabletop game feel alive. The ability to present your players with organic moments of narrative, unconnected to a broader campaign or plot, lets your players breathe. It lets them engage with your world on their terms. And it lets your players see your world as it exists without them. But there is definitely a right and a wrong way to do a random encounter. Without considering how an encounter engages your players, how to get your players to interact with the things you present to them, a random encounter can feel less like a game and more like a museum exhibit or a model train set. Something that's interesting, but like every diorama, something you can't touch. So how do you make a random encounter? How do you get your players to interact with something that you put before them? What are the ingredients of a good random encounter, and how is it different than just stumbling across a miniature pony in the Seattle forest? A good place to start when asking yourself how to build a random encounter is to ask yourself the question, what is a random encounter supposed to be? For the purposes of this examination, I want you to imagine a road trip. Say you and your friends are traveling from your hometown to New York City. There's a lot of adventure waiting for you in New York City, but before you get there, there are a lot of stops you're going to make along the way. You have your point A, your hometown, any town, USA or Mexico or Canada, and you have your point B, which is the Big Apple, New York City, where the campaign happens. A random encounter is what happens on your way to point B from point A, in the time between the plot points of the overarching narrative. For example, from my hometown to the East Coast is about a, 20-hour drive when we made it that one time? Now, I'm all for driving all the way through the night without any breaks, but literally everybody else I've ever taken a trip like that with wants to stop reasonably for things like sleeping and eating. In the span of that 20-hour drive, there are a number of different opportunities for stories to happen. But, much like on a road trip of this length, there are some stories that you want to tell and some stories that you kind of just don't bother with. Random encounters are very similar to this. If there's one thing that a random encounter should be, it should be interesting. Something has to happen in this random encounter for it to be worthwhile. It's not enough to just present your players with a diorama. Rather, it's important to invite your players to interact with a playset. So, how do you do this? How do you make an encounter interesting? There are a couple of different elements to each random encounter that you can swap in and out as needed, but as a basic guideline, there are 4 main parts that I like to include anytime I try to put together a random encounter for my games. And remember, the goal here is to get your players to interact with the random encounter. As Dungeon Masters, I feel like we've all had that session where we present a random encounter to the players and they look at it and decide to leave. And if you haven't had this experience before, don't worry, it's the worst. So the first step towards making your random encounters memorable, exciting, engaging, and interesting is novelty. A lot of people take novelty to mean wacky or crazy or kooky or some sort of interesting by way of zany antics, and that's not what I mean in this case. What I mean by novelty in this case is just anything that sticks out, anything that can act like the nail sticking up out of the floorboard. A 3-foot-tall clown is very zany, but a child crying is also novel, especially if they're all alone, somewhere where you would expect a parent to be. Thinking about the road trip, if you stop somewhere and get gas, that's not novel. If you stop somewhere and they're completely out of gas, and so are you, that's novel. That's a unique situation that would seem remarkable to travelers on a journey. And the same thing applies in dungeons as well. If there are any moments that you can think of that would stand out to your players traveling through, say, the Underdark or through the Lich's caverns or what have you, then go with that as the basis for your random encounter. But novelty is not the end-all and be-all of a random encounter. It feels like when I make random encounters that don't work, they stop at novelty. All I do in these random encounters is present my players with something that seems interesting or cool that they walk by. Then they decide to leave. So how do you get your players to engage with this novel situation? The second element of a random encounter that I really like to think about when I'm preparing my next session is how the situation can be presented as an unresolved situation. A lack of resolution, a situation that is incomplete, means that your players have a door into the scenario. You're on the road trip to New York City and you stop somewhere and you see a cat. That's great. That's a great cat. That's a very cute cat. You might pet the cat, but then you'll probably go on your merry way. But if you stop for gas and somebody asks you for help finding a cat, well, now you have an unresolved situation. This is known as a hook, something to grab your player's attention and bring them into the scenario as it's presented to them. And there are any number of ways to make a good hook for your random encounter, and a lot of them are dependent on your setting. If you're in Barovia, you can come across somebody who seems like a nice person, but who has a strange fixation on the rising moon, and who starts sprouting fur and fangs while they're screaming at the players to do something. That's a pretty good hook, but that wouldn't happen in, say, Eberron. I don't know, it might, who knows. Much like novelty, however, this doesn't tell the full story. If your players have a novel situation with a good hook, and they walk through this situation and find out that the cat was at the person's house all along, then it might as well not have happened. So that brings us to our next element of a good random encounter, which is the opportunity to have an impact. This is the chance to make a difference on the outcome of the situation. When you're trying to come up with a random encounter, it's a good idea to try and think of potential outcomes, whether the players get involved or not. Because remember, what we're trying to do is portray your campaign setting, your world, as it really would play out without the players' involvement. If the players refuse to help this person find their cat, maybe the cat stays stuck up in that tree forever. The outcome of the situation would be different if the players got involved. In fact, the players getting involved would provide the opportunity for a very concrete alternative outcome. A good example of this from one of my games is I presented my players with 2 people and a pile of treasure. The person on the left was a good guy, the person on the right was a bad guy, and they were trying to decide who got the treasure. Now, this seems like a situation that would resolve itself in one way or the other, but it definitely had an impact that 4 heavily armed adventurers strolled on into the clearing where they found these 2 individuals fighting each other. Likewise, this element of a random encounter is a great opportunity to give your players a chance to pass judgment on some aspect of your world. That sounds a lot more hostile than I meant it. I really just mean to say that a lot of times there are situations in a fantasy world where people can have a moral opinion on the situation at hand. So in my treasure example, for example, we have the good guy who stands for integrity and what have you, and the bad guy who stands for this is a dog-eat-dog world, only the strongest survive. Which do your players side with? The opportunity to have an impact on a random encounter can also be portrayed as the opportunity to learn something about your characters. The opportunity for the encounter to have an impact on them. Which brings us to the final ingredient, the payoff. No random encounter feels complete without some tangible result of getting involved in this in the first place. Now, this can be something as simple as a pile of treasure, and that's perfectly good and a wonderful payoff for any character playing any tabletop role-playing game. But it doesn't have to be limited exclusively to treasure. This can be something as good as meeting a fun NPC or helping somebody that they might meet in town later. This could be a really fun combat encounter or a really fun loss to a scary bad guy. One way or the other, there has to be something at the end of this chain of events for the players to feel like they have earned. A payoff in the case of a random encounter doesn't necessarily mean material benefit or experience points. Though both of those are great and you should think about what they would be in the case of your random encounter. But the payoff should be something specific and unique to the encounter at hand. Gold, treasure, or whether it's a fun scenario. One way or the other, it should be the logical conclusion of your encounter. So we have these 4 ingredients, and you can kind of put them in and take them out as you see fit, but it's a good idea to consider each one for every encounter you plan. We have the novelty of the situation, something unique to your setting that would stand out to your players, whether it's a threat or a unique enemy or some danger of the environment that they come across that they wouldn't have otherwise come across if they were in, like, downtown Cincinnati. Something that makes the encounter stand out above the hubbub of everyday life. Next we have the hook, the element of the random encounter that demands the player's attention and gives the player a hint as to how they can get involved. And this can be something as simple as your players see a treasure chest. Somebody asks them for help. Or it can be something a little more complicated, like maybe your players come across a wrecked caravan and see a trail of bloody footprints heading off to the east. One way or the other, this hook should give your players the next couple of steps that they can take to get involved in the random encounter. After that comes the ability for your players to have an impact on the situation. There's gotta be a word for this, and I'm not sure what it is. It's not objective and it's not a beat. It's more, there's a recipe here, and without the ingredient that your players provide, the cake won't happen. In a random encounter, it's important to consider how your players could have an impact on the events. And finally, the payoff. Whatever this happens to be, it's the final result of the equation of the random encounter. Your players plus a goblin child lost in the woods equals goblins rewarding your players for returning their lost child. So that's the basic anatomy of a random encounter. Those are the rudimentary ingredients that I always try to consider, whether I succeed at it or not, with every random encounter that I try to put together for my players. Now, that's all well and good, but how do you do this in a game? Random encounters are supposed to be just that, right? Random. A lot of times for a random encounter, all you're doing is rolling dice to see what the table says. Integrating a random encounter into a setting is a lot easier than you would think. In order to build a random encounter in any new setting I come across, I like to establish a couple of specific things before I get started. First of all, I try to establish the characters of the setting. And this isn't so much the individual NPCs as it is the different type of people and monsters that you would find in any particular campaign. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? What are their objectives and motives? In other words, who are the villains? Who are the heroes? What do they do? And how do they do it? This gives you a good window into how to build a random encounter because every monster you come across is going to have different habits and patterns. A dragon, for example, is going to have a lair and they're going to have different prey that they track down. They're going to have different methods of stalking that prey and attacking that prey. And if this is a dragon-centric setting, like a place where dragons are a big problem, maybe there are people who need help fighting dragons, like a holy order of dragon fighters. All of these elements are things that your players can come across as a random encounter, and all of them start to kind of write themselves. What would one of these dragon fighters need from your players if they were to come across them? What would one of these dragons look like, or sound like, or leave behind after they've attacked? After you have established who the players are in your setting, you can take a moment to figure out what scenarios they might present. Think about being a regular person in the world that you've presented, either a good guy or a bad guy. What things might they come across that would be interesting for your players to engage with? What everyday problems might they have that would stand out? Another good angle to scope out when you're trying to integrate a random encounter into a particular setting is to try and figure out what type of payoff a certain setting would have. It's a little fourth wall breaking to do a random loot table drop at the end of fighting a giant hornet and have the hornet give your players 500 gold pieces and a scepter. Instead, it might be a good idea to think about what the payoff of fighting a giant hornet would be. Maybe they rescue somebody who was attacked by the hornets, or maybe the giant hornets make really tasty honey. I know hornets don't make honey. I couldn't think of anything else that would be in a hornet's nest. Or to take it even further back, what would the cat guy give you? I mean, if you find somebody at a gas station who needs help finding their cat, then what would they give as a reward? Maybe they would invite the players over for dinner as a thank you. Or maybe they find out that this person is actually a drug dealer and need to figure out how to deal with that situation. The important thing is that every setting is going to have its specific characters, situations, and rewards. When you're building a random encounter, in other words, you can think of the ingredients as the mechanisms, the inner workings of the clock, and you can think of the other parts that I just mentioned as the palette, the colors that you use, or the different thematic elements. And before I send all of you wonderful adventurers off on your merry way to build random encounters to your heart's content, there are a couple of general tips that I like to keep in mind when I'm building my own random encounters that I would like to share with you now. First off, a random encounter should typically stay within the realm of one session, maybe 2 or 3 if it's particularly cool. You're not looking for something to upstage the main campaign. You're trying to come up with an interesting anecdote that happened on the way to the main campaign. A random encounter should have a visible end goal. You should be able to see the finish line of a random encounter from the start. A guy asks for help finding his cat. Once you find the cat, it's over. Now, your players will have a say in this. They'll have some opportunity to say when the random encounter is over, and if they seem like they're really into it, then it can keep going for as long as they want it to. But a random encounter should also be a self-contained unit that doesn't distract from the overall story. And finally, one of the biggest things that can help make a random encounter stick in your player's mind is consideration for the tone. Now, this is a subject that deserves its own episode entirely, but for now, this just means thinking about how you want this encounter to feel. What emotion you want to spark in your players. Do you want this encounter to be comic? Do you want this encounter to be tense and action-packed? Or do you want this encounter to be scary or uncanny? Deciding on the emotion that you want to evoke in your players can help give you a guide on deciding what elements to include in the random encounter in the first place. So that's a crash course on how to build a random encounter. Remember, the goal of a random encounter is to try to make it interesting. It's to try and hook your players' attention and give them something that they can engage with. Some interesting story that they might be able to tell somebody at point B about their trip from point A. Random encounters are about seeing the world in motion. Giving your players a chance to see what the setting gets up to when they're not there, and letting your players take a part in whatever that happens to be. And the best way to get your players to take part is to make something for them to take part in. The number one piece of advice that I can give for any random encounter that you may come up with or that you're going to try and build is that your setting is interesting. Whether it's a homebrew setting or your interpretation of Barovia. Random encounters are an opportunity to show your players how interesting this setting is. And that's it! That's my episode on random encounters. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed. For all of you Dungeon Masters out there, I hope this was informative and evocative, and I hope it helps you bring your games to the level you know they can be. thank you once again for joining me in Dungeon Master U, where you are the Dungeon Master. As always, feel free to get in touch with me on Twitter or leave a comment below. Like and subscribe as well. I think we're supposed to say that, right? Anyway, thank you for joining me. I had fun. I hope you did too. Farewell, Dungeon Master. This is the announcement. So usually after that end screen there, I use this as a place to put funny outtakes or anything like that. But I'm excited to announce the fact that I am going to launch an itch store. I'll leave a link down in this description below. And a table for random encounters that I have written is available now for pay what you want. This is just a quick assortment of things that I came up with that you can plug and play for your particular setting. I call it what happens on the road. Remember, you can find it at itch.io/Lee-Lehrer. Maybe that's lee-lehrer.itch.io. I'll get back to you on that. But you can find it for pay what you want at the link below. Go now. You're wonderful. You're such a cool person. And I know you're going to have an awesome session next time. Heck yeah. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.